realism of a lived-in New York neighborhood, to the depiction of the spiritual experience of being engulfed in your passion, to the ethereal before-afterlife, which might not have the same level of distinct personality and design as Inside Out, but then you see they have these god, counselor, deity things that were designed based on these abstract wire sculptures, but the way that they integrated them into the 3D space, oh my god, they're so pretty. But contrary to its initial impression that this movie kills, but not really, its protagonist in the first 5 minutes, Soul isn't really about death. Soul is about life. And Soul continues Pete Docter's trademark to push for stories that aim to be both highly emotionally resonant, thought-provoking, and just a little bit more narratively deep than other family films tend to try. But to do something a little bit different, to further my slightly spoilerish takes on the film regarding its story, impact, and legacy, and also because everyone else has already seen and reviewed it by now, I'm going to frame my further thoughts in the context of two major points that come up in other people's reviews. And the first one might seem like a bit of an odd bone to pick considering, but the constant clarification that Soul is not a kids movie. Now I know what people mean by this, not that kids can't or won't enjoy it, but merely that they might not fully comprehend the film's themes and questions posed, and merely that it is just not exceedingly exciting or funny, in that it literally does not fart glitter in your face. I get it, and it's not incorrect. I just keep finding it odd that everyone makes a note of this. First of all, it's already like a really gross oversimplification that we keep on labeling things as kid appropriate when we tend to label kids as pretty much anything below a teenager, which means that that is 12 years where a human being goes through the most mental and emotional development, and what is appropriate for one child at one age is going to be very different from even just the next year. But I know that when we say that, we just tend to mean this is safe for 3-year-olds. But even just the idea of needing to make a note of this movie is going to include ideas and concepts that may be more meaningful when you've got a little bit more life experience under your belt and can actually understand what's going on. I mean, isn't that like most kids' movies? Especially Pixar films? Like, yep, I'm totally sure that children under 6 totally related to the midlife crisis amidst the non-Ayn Randian debates about exceptionalism, not to mention how many kids' movies somehow have to do with, like, business buyouts, but more likely it's slightly less about the themes than it is about the lack of easily branded child entertainment draws, like talking animals and inanimate objects, or superheroes. In fact, the Pixar movie that's probably closest to this tonally is probably Ratatouille, also considered unusual for being pretty light on comedy, with a fairly realistic setting, with a lot of dialogue-heavy scenes, and ends with a speech about criticism. But its main character's a talking rat, so that's all we need. Heck, Cars 3 is actually a pretty solemn film about mentors and retirement. But it's got talking cars, so woo! Whereas Soul looks much less child-appealing because it stars a middle-aged man. I mean, so does Incredibles, but whatever. Still, if you want to talk about the child entertainment draws, Soul definitely still has those, between the chibi Soul designs and the entire middle act that includes a body swap, many instances of flailing physical antics, and a talking cat. Well, we matched our child quota. We got a talking animal in there. But one that ultimately couldn't be put into the advertising because, unlike pretty much everyone else, Pixar cares about keeping its story a secret until you actually see it. And even given that, Soul still confines itself to a fairly recognizable format, being a story that's ultimately about passion, which Pixar has definitely done before, and whose conflict involves both a ticking clock and a pursuing antagonist, which is already more standard than Ratatouille, and honestly, Soul is way funnier. I know this seems like a weird thing to fixate on, and I totally get what people mean by this. I know because of the lack of comedy that this probably isn't going to end up being a lot of children's favorite film, and I know not just because of what it talks about, but the way it talks about it is going to make it much more relatable to older audiences. In fact, I have a pretty solid hypothesis that watching Soul is going to become a standard graduation ritual. Still, I think the tendency to declare this not for kids just because it's not as bombastic or colorful as funny as other mainstream entries is still valid if you're only looking at it as a child-oriented comedy. But as a child-oriented character drama, I think that it's potentially more relatable than the subjects of a lot of other family films. For one, that it actually has an active child-coded co-protagonist. Something I've wondered multiple times why there aren't more of these in family films. And yeah, I know that child actors can be difficult when it comes to live action, but why aren't they more prevalent animated ones? I mean, easy answer, children aren't writing the scripts. And I think that because a lot of older audiences are so connected to Joe's journey that they underestimate 22's journey of self-discovery, which is pretty much your entire life as a child. You're constantly trying to figure out what this crazy world is that you've been born into and your place in it. Plus, while the entire concept of what you're going to do with your life doesn't have the same, pressure to figure it out instantly in the same way that a teenager or an adult might, the question of what do they want to be when they grow up is a very frequent question posed to them, and one that they are almost constantly thinking about their future. When children do pretend play, this is literally them running simulations on how they think life works. That kids are trying to figure out the right way to properly be people is a massive part of what 22 is going through. However, specifically, 22 is the problem child of this prenatal spiritual education setting, but also with the limitations that would imply. 22 is someone to whom the normal system has failed until she gets some literal real-world experience. But before then, she becomes the typical sardonic adolescent, usually internalized by the young and dumb, as somebody cool because they play by their own rules, already have everything figured out, and that means that they can just slack off and gets one over on the authorities, and I don't need school, man. But as is usually revealed in the good stories, as a troubled individual that uses sarcasm and frequently manufactured self-serving philosophies to hide their insecurities. In this case, exacerbated by all of their mentors being composed of literally the greatest minds and most accomplished people in world history. And ergo never feels like they're going to be that same level of accomplished or special, especially since they haven't been able to meet the bare minimum of acceptable. So why bother trying? And can we get a shout out for framing something as a brush-off joke in the first act that turns into something incredibly serious and traumatizing in the climax? At the same time, letting parents know how their slight, even forgettable comments can drastically affect their children. And sure, the arc about what it takes to be a good mentor is certainly an underplayed part of Joe's journey, but I find this potentially meaningful, especially to young kids who are also going through their own education with similar kinds of intimidation. We do have a system where if a child doesn't hit certain developmental milestone or obtain certain abilities within a time stream to the liking of all of the adults around them, that they don't get to move forward to the next level of being a person and are, if indirectly, deemed a failure. In the context of 22 being held in comparison to figures meant to be extraordinary, which does connect to Joe's story about what he thinks it means to have a worthwhile life, because it's not merely about just being able to do the thing you want, because if it was literally just about playing jazz, he can do that whenever. It's that he needs to accomplish something in order for his life to have meaning. And that is a feeling that literally everybody struggles with. And kids, definitely not less so. Even when I was young and I was just comparing myself to child stars, there was this depressing sense that I was less because I was at so-and-so age, but I wasn't a renowned singer or actor on the Disney Channel. But this is the age of social media, where it is practically now a daily ritual to go online and find thousands of individuals in your vicinity and age group that are constantly being shoved in your face on how much more they've accomplished than you. And your self-worth and global importance is literally quantified. And then Soul says, no, you do not need to be extraordinary. You don't need to prove yourself, because life is about more than what you can just accomplish. Soul isn't just the anti-Cutie Mark movie, it is the anti-Chosen One movie. Because for as much as that story gives its readers a fun power fantasy, it inevitably encourages the idea that your worth is how individually powerful you are, or how influential you are, or how much you single-handedly can affect the world. But no, you don't need to be exceptional. You are worthwhile just because you are alive. Having dreams is definitely a big part of life, as well as having goals, and just for doing the things that make you happy, barring a sensible moral code. And even then, what about death? I mean, this is hardly the first time that a kids movie has talked about it, and in this context, way less depressing than many of them. But again, I think that people underestimate that this is a thing on kids' minds. Kids comprehend the idea of death pretty young. At some other points, usually between the ages of 4 and literally any time, is the moment where it really hits them that death is a thing that will happen to them. I had a period of time, somewhere 7, 8, 9, where I could not stop thinking not just about what would happen after I died, but what was I before I was born? What was the moment where I suddenly came into consciousness? Now, as I said, despite its advertising, Soul isn't really about that. Even though I think that was probably the original plan for this film, Soul is not about death. Soul is about life. And that brings me to the second point, which is, of course, the ending. For the most part, Soul has been extremely well received all around. Character, story, script, and almost unanimously, the barber scene and the piano montage are the highlights, as well as Moonwind. Moonwind is incredible. But the big divide, or the mark that makes this just under other Pixar classics, regards the ending. Whether it's too vague, whether Joe should have died, whether it should have been more, should we have gotten an epilogue? And honestly, this dissension makes perfect sense considering that the creators themselves went through so many potential endings that included all of those, including what happened to David's character. I definitely get that leaving it open-ended is not very satisfying, but I agree with the general idea of the ending in terms of how it relates to the film, both in terms of its inconclusiveness and letting Joe live. Granted, if you were making the case for which one of these made the most sense in terms of the movie's own internal logic, then sure, Joe dying makes the most sense, only because of the incredibly arbitrary way in which the Earth pass works. But I support him living for pretty much the reason that I've said. Soul is not about death. Soul is about life. The point of the film is that it wants to inspire people to live life. This wouldn't necessarily have been completely undone if they had chose to let Joe die, but it does put a little bit of a damper on it, because the inspiration to keep living isn't quite the same if it's also coupled with, yeah, but it's okay if you just die tomorrow. What I'm not completely thrilled with is the way it happens. I mean, it's just this very quick, tacked-on, simplistic, literal Deus Ex Machina. Yes, it clearly would have been more satisfying if it had happened in a way that confirmed with the rest of the movie's logic or natural consequences, but as a lot of people have said, even if you have an issue with it, it doesn't undo what makes Soul great. It's suitable, it's just not impressive. And in terms of its lack of epilogue, I get that this is particularly aggravating. Did Joe go back to playing jazz? Or maybe he discovered that teaching was more fulfilling? Or was it some combination? Or perhaps even a completely different third thing? Or my favorite, since he knows how to do the entire great before inspiration meditation thing, maybe he's the first living mentor. Maybe the souls literally use his body as a trial run. But yeah, then how does he do that and literally not end up in a loony bin? It is frustrating because it is instinctively contradictory to how we're used to watching films, where we usually see our protagonist have an objective, see them achieve that objective, and then it's over. And the assumption is that all of their problems were solved and they were just happy for the rest of their lives. But giving us a definitive answer into what our characters ended up doing for their happy ending, not definitively, but could be seen as undermining the major theme of the film, because A, would convey that they ultimately were destined to do something specific, and that choice was ultimately the key to their eternal happiness, and B, even if you achieve your objective, as Joe does, you are in fact not going to be rewarded with an eternity of emotional orgasms, because even after you've achieved a goal, there's still life after that. The other detour that it takes from expectations is how this movie in many ways follows the path of similar films of the self-absorbed adult who gets charmed by a child, which teaches them humility, and as a result they decided, I'm going to throw away my lifelong dream and or that promotion to become a teacher or a coach, because this is my true calling. You know, Mighty Ducks. And I'm super glad they did not do this. Not only because, again, the entire point of this film is that there is no true calling, but I'm also just kind of over the way that movies fetishize the joys of teaching. Like, teachers aren't paid in child smiles, guys. You can't just compensate all of the other crap they have to go through just by constantly telling them how awesome they are. And yeah, maybe you figured out partially why I'm not a teacher anymore, and no, I don't believe that every single teacher feels the same way about that. Still, the insinuation that Joe didn't feel complete after joining the band is not necessarily because he found teaching more fulfilling. It was merely that he had just hyped up this moment in his mind so much that it got to the point where reality couldn't compete with it. And ultimately, that tunnel vision in pursuit of his goal just made it harder for him to enjoy other potential meaningful life experiences, like getting to know his totally awesome barber. And of course, it doesn't mean that he completely hated teaching, but a side effect of the tunnel vision meant that he was only able to see teaching as A, an outlet for his actual passion, but also B, a roadblock to actually achieving that dream. And then him going back to 22, again, is not confirmation that being a mentor is the right choice for him. It's literally just him fixing a mistake that he helped cause. It's just him being a better person than he was at the start of the film. And yeah, of course, of my mind, I like the idea that he ultimately did a little bit of everything, but ultimately I think the movie's ending decision, if imperfectly conveyed, is the right choice. And it's true that it could have gone deeper into this topic and debunked other misconceptions of life worth, like fame and social media, to the amount of people that you've positively influenced. But it holds back on that typical conversation because that would still be implying that there's a right way to live life, whereas the entire point of this film is that there isn't. But I know that the ending's not the only issue. Soul is definitely one of those movies where it is very easy to nitpick how this world works. The one thing I wasn't crazy about was the personality pavilions. I get that it's just a matter of whether it's your take on personality being a nature versus nurture, but I'd still feel better about it if the counselors don't themselves tell the souls into which pavilion to go to. But it's true that that might be kind of the point, as the depiction, the before life, is the limitations and the processing of a systematic education. But then things like, what about the cat? Well, the easy explanation is that cats have 9 lives, but even then, that's still unfair. It didn't do anything but help patients in a hospital. Oh yeah, and what about his injuries? And do you expect me to believe that out of all of the history of the world where people have frequently died very suddenly, this is the first time anyone ran away from the big escalator in the sky because they weren't ready, or they jumped off, or they fell off? And is Terry's counting job actually important? Because nobody else seems to care. But like with any of these movies, those minor issues only matter as much as you care. And to so many, the topics and the positive takeaway and the feelings you come away this movie with, in addition to the art and the character and the dialogue and the music, ultimately makes the experience more fulfilling than just fixating on those minor issues. It truly is a fantastic film, and it's just a matter of where it's going to end up on everyone's Pixar ranking.
This form of torment would be more appropriate, considering that Lost Kingdom does kind of wrap up the story of season 3 and really the first 3 seasons. It's the end of this era of Winx, if you will. You know, about Bloom's parents and stuff.